If a recent history of the subject is to be believed, the average man or woman will spend 20 seconds a week in orgasm, or, to extrapolate, around 12 minutes a year or 10 hours in a typical lifetime. For something that takes so little of our time, the orgasm occupies a grossly outsized portion of our economy, science, and cultural imagination. There's no shortage of handbooks, ancient and modern, that can advise you about the best ways to satisfy your lover. If we want to say something is good, we describe it as better than sex. Anything that tastes delicious or illicit is orgasmic, and Arnold Schwarzenegger is even able to describe flexing his biceps as satisfying as ejaculating. For ancient medics, the orgasm was what Thomas Lacker, author of Making Sex, has called a bodily signal of a cycle of mortality and generation. Ancient thought held that certain conditions, sluggishness, for example, were caused by an excess of phlegm in the body. The congestion could be relieved by ejaculating. Aristotle actually calls semen the secretion of an excrement. Simultaneously, semen was believed to be the purest form of blood, which contained, naturally, the very essence of life. In this way, the male orgasm was not just a prerequisite for procreation, but could also regulate the temperature and the disposition of the body. It kept a person in balance. I say person because many ancient medics believed in a two-seed model of procreation in which both men and women ejaculated and contributed seed to the generative mix. The 2nd century CE Dr. Galen even thought he had discovered female seed when he observed fluid in the horns of the uterus, the fallopian tubes, to you and me. For Aristotle, though, pleasure and procreation were distinct. The pleasure men experience in orgasm is not connected to the production of semen. His evidence? Young boys and old men experience pleasure even though they are unable to produce offspring. What was the orgasm then? For most ancient philosophers, it was a final blast of heat that expelled generative substances from the body. Interestingly, for ancient and medieval writers, women were expected to orgasm during intercourse. The 6th century physician Aetios of Amida thought of the female orgasm as a sign of conception, if, in the very coitional act itself, she notices a certain tremor. She is pregnant. Even though the clitoris was not identified as a locus of pleasure until 1558, medieval midwives thought that the female orgasm was both routine and a necessary prerequisite for conception. The rapturous shudder of orgasm was a sign that the womb has drawn the semen into itself and sealed itself off to allow pregnancy to commence. The orgasm, therefore, was a potential liability. Excite a woman too much and too soon, said Hippocrates, and her womb will close up. What might sound like a refreshing pause in oppressive male-centered attitudes toward sex was actually the reverse. For, if women cannot get pregnant without orgasm, it should be impossible for rape victims to get pregnant. The 13th century British legal text Fleta, written in Latin, stipulates, without a woman's consent she could not conceive. Similarly, Samuel Farr's Elements of Medical Jurisprudence, 1814, states, without an excitation of lust, no conception can probably take place. The legacy of this literally medieval idea is still felt today among, for example, Republican candidates who think, if it's illegitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down. The description of enjoyable sex as sinful is linked to the rise of Christianity. Certainly it is not the case that religious leaders always and everywhere deem sexual gratification immoral, but in the 16th century Dr. Francisco Becerra, a canon in the Church of Antequera, Spain, declared that the sex act in marriage is always sinful and that our Lord can no longer tolerate the sinfulness of coitus in marriage. Becerra is at the extreme, but a cloud of suspicion hung over sexual practices that were not natural intercourse. Orgasm from foreplay, in other words, was a mortal sin. Instead, women were encouraged to remain passive and emulate the example of Zenobia, ancient queen of Palmyra, modern-day Turkey, who did not engage in sex unless she was trying to become pregnant, and who allegedly had no more sensitivity in her sexual parts than in her feet or hands. How would a woman do this? Well, according to the practical advice of 17th-century theologian Tomás Sánchez, by lying still, making the sign of the cross, and praying that God not allow the male partner to slip into orgasmic pleasure. It wasn't until the 1940s that Kinsey reported that 40% of women achieved their first orgasm through masturbation. Later research was interested in the evolutionary purpose of the female orgasm. In 1967, Desmond Morris, the author of The Naked Ape, hypothesized that the evolutionary purpose of the female orgasm was